Hello again, I am Blunty. I'm in Los Angeles on the invite of the folks at AMD because they're showing off their two next big deal products ready for launch. The first, of course, is Threadripper, and the other one is the long-awaited gamer-focused GPU from their new Vega architecture, the Radeon RX Vega. There's a ton of really cool stuff about Threadripper I want to talk about, and I will, and with the 1950X and 1920X dropping into the world in just about a week and a half, you won't have to wait long. In fact, plans are already underway to build a system out so I can dig into these chips in proper detail with reviews and benchmarks and tests and my usual practical real-world focus tests as soon as I can. And at the end of August, there'll also be the 1900X Threadripper at a price that made most of the room I was in gasp and mumble excitedly when it was announced. But Threadripper is the highest end of the high end, and let's face it, most of you don't need it. Want it? Yeah, probably, but need? Well, we'll get to that. The Radeon RX Vega, though, that's going to tick a lot more boxes for a lot more people and a lot more gamers. The Vega for gamers comes in two main flavors, well, 2 3/4 flavors really, because the Radeon Vega RX 64, which is the official name now by the way, has 3 variations at launch, at least as a pure AMD card before all the board partners start slapping their own coolers and such and custom boards all around them. There's the standard Radeon Vega RX 64 in a classic AMD blower-style cooler, the Radeon Vega RX 64 Limited Edition with a functionally similar blower but classed up a bit with a metal sheath, lovely brushed aluminium, looks even better in person by the way. And of course that iconic little pixel light from the Pro Series Vega cards up there in the corner, and then there's the Radeon Vega RX 64 liquid cooled with an integrated all-in-one liquid cooler, with the regular version slapped with a $499 tag, which puts it on par price-wise with the likes of the higher end of the GTX 1070s, but with real-world in-game performance that many of us are expecting to float closer to the world of the GTX 1080, it presents a very enticing option. Price close to a 1070, performance close to a 1080. How are you going to say no to that, if it pans out that way? We'll have to wait and see. But then there's also the Radeon Vega RX 56. It comes in at $399, which is what you'd pay for a nice GTX 1060. But again, we probably should expect performance closer to the next tier up from Nvidia. 1060 price, 1070 performance. We'll have to wait and see to be sure, but that's kind of what we're expecting-ish. And of course, sitting on the Vega architecture, they've all got HBM2 memory on board, which is much faster than the GDDR5 that the Nvidia boards use. On the Radeon Vega 64, you're looking at a TDP of 220 watts for the air-cooled version. But we're told that the architecture is extremely flexible when it comes to that aspect and the form factor in general. So we should see a lot of interesting variants as far as that goes. For example, later this year we should expect to see a nano-style Radeon Vega 64 with a TDP of around 150 watts. I may even be able to post a pic of the prototype within a few hours of this video going up tonight, so keep an eye on my Twitter if you're curious about that. The Radeon Vega 56, as shown, has a TDP of 165 watts. The Vega 64 has 64 compute units. Guess how many the 56 has? The base clock on the 64 is 1247 MHz with a boost of 1546, and the memory bandwidth is a big fat 484 GB per second, quite a lead over the GTX 1080's comparatively mere 320 GB per second. The liquid-cooled edition has the same memory bandwidth, but it clocks higher, of course, 1406 MHz and 1677 on the boost. The RX Vega 56 has a base clock of 1156 and boosting to 1471 MHz, and we're told to expect these cards to be very good overclockers, so long as the cooling solution is up to the task, of course, as is the case with any overclocking. Oh, and for those who've been making flat assumptions about these cards and their performance based on the gaming benchmarks some outlets did based on the developer-focused Vega Frontier Edition, well, we're told that's basically irrelevant. The Frontier Edition does not have the same power management as the proper gaming cards do, and the drivers are simply not at all optimized for gaming. So for the RX Vega cards, the proper gaming ones, we should see a noticeable uptick in game performance compared to what some have tried to assume based on the non-gaming Frontier Edition's performance in games. And indeed, as I alluded to earlier, AMD are targeting the GTX 1080 as the comparison point we should be looking at for the Vega 64 and the GTX 1070 for the comparison against the Vega 56. Which does mean, of course, that price versus performance math when compared to Team Green should be a very big selling point indeed. Now, when it comes to actual performance, AMD aren't necessarily targeting the maximum frame rate. Instead, they're trying to pull out a more consistent performance in-game when it comes to minimum frame rates. So the overall gaming experience, especially when you've got a FreeSync monitor that keeps the refresh rate in line with your frame rate, is as pleasant as possible, which actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, sure, it's nice being able to point to a big frames per second number for bragging rights and such, but in reality, it's the drops in frame rate, the lowest points in the frame rate, in particularly challenging parts of games, that impact the gaming experience the most. Those are the ones you notice. Because let's be frank, most people won't notice the difference between 130 and 150 frames per second on most games. But you can be damn sure you're going to notice the difference between a game dropping down to 30-something and find it far more jarring than you will when a game drops down to 45 or 50-something frames per second. And so that's where AMD have been trying their hardest to improve. And the charts they showed us of various games and comparisons seem to suggest a significant success in that area. But as always, and I'll keep saying it, it'll be the real-world tests in the hands of us normal folk that will really tell the tale. But things are looking hopeful. So the end of the story is this: the promise of Radeon Vega RX is better value and more consistency, which sounds pretty good to me, quite honestly, and with the software side of the Radeon GPUs having made significant improvements over the last year or so, particularly in things like their relive recording functions, especially useful to YouTubers like me, and the clever stuff they're doing with performance profiles and such, well, it's fair to say that the choice between flying a green flag or a red flag over your gaming rig is going to become much more difficult than it has been in a long time now when Radeon Vega RX lands. Thanks for watching, I am Blunty, and I'll catch you next time.